Good evening. I'm Pat Manning. I want to thank you for joining us in the study tonight. We continue our study of the theory of premillennialism. For the last several weeks, we've studied premillennialism, the doctrine of the return of Christ before a supposed 1,000-year reign here on the earth. And we've talked about several doctrines that are connected with premillennialism. Let me remind you that we have covered, first of all, the establishment of the kingdom. I did that in the very first study with you. And then we did a two-part study on the theory of premillennialism. I showed you what the theory was and what premillennialists teach. And then we came in the second study and showed what was wrong with the theory. And then for the last 2 weeks following that, we studied the beast in Daniel and in Revelation. And we did a two-part study of those beasts and identified them and showed that the beast was Rome, that the heads on that beast represented the Caesars that rule Rome, and that this beast has already come and gone, and that there is no future Antichrist predicted in the book of Daniel or in the book of Revelation. We may have some world dictator one of these days, but he is not predicted in Daniel or Revelation, because the things that are revealed there have already been fulfilled. And if you're not familiar with those subjects, I would highly recommend that you go back and watch the videos. In fact, all of the things that we've studied thus far are on the web, and they're available to you on our web page. And you can go back and view these videos and study these topics with us many, many times, as often as you want. Tonight we come to another section of study. It's a discussion of the 24th chapter of Matthew. Matthew 24 is it's a favorite chapter for those who believe in the premillennial theory, because in this chapter of Matthew 24, premillennials believe that they find authority for the rapture, for a coming Antichrist, for a great 7-year tribulation, etc. They believe all of these doctrines are taught in Matthew 24. They are not. Actually, the 24th chapter of Matthew is a discourse given by Jesus. It was given in 30 AD, and the contents of it were fulfilled in 70 AD. Jesus is giving a discourse on the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies, and that happened in 70 AD under General Titus, whose father Vespasian, who was the emperor then, sent him to accomplish that task and to capture and take Jerusalem and destroy it, actually. So Matthew 24 is the Lord's prediction of those coming events. It concerned things that were part of that generation. And that's very important that we understand that, because premillennials look at the chapter and they find tribulation mentioned in it, and they see earthquakes and famines and pestilences and wars and rumors of wars and an abomination of desolation. They see stars falling from heaven, and the sun and the moon not giving their lights, and such things as this, and conclude that the Lord's dealing with the end of time. And actually, he's not dealing with that at all. This is apocalyptic speech for the destruction of a nation. We will probably do this study tonight in 2 parts. I don't think that I can finish it in one. I would prefer to do it all in one with you. And yet I think it would probably be too lengthy for most of you to stay with, and that you'd probably break it up and view it at different intervals anyway. So we'll see how far we get and stop at an appropriate place when we've covered a sufficient amount of time. Since this chapter is not well understood, I want us to study it thoroughly. After all, we're leaving these topics on the web as a resource material, and so I want to give you as much study material on this as we're able to give in these studies. Before we get to Matthew 24 and the text itself, however, I want you to notice a couple of passages of Scripture. I want to call your attention to these, and watch the language here in these verses. Now, this is from Matthew 23. It's the chapter right before Matthew 24 that we're about to study. And Jesus is talking to the Jews, and he says to them in Matthew 23:34, "Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes. And some of them ye shall kill and crucify. Some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Now watch. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. The one he's talking to here. All of these things, what things? All the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom they had slain between the temple and the altar. Jesus said, verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. So all of these things are about to come on the very generation that Christ is talking to. And these will be the things in Matthew 24. These are days of vengeance upon the Jewish people. They had killed the prophets. They had stoned those that God had sent to them. They had persecuted those men from city to city, scourged them in their synagogues, shed the blood of many of them. And now God at last sent his one and only Son, his only begotten Son, to them. And they rejected him and condemned him to death and turned him over to the Romans to crucify. And now Jesus is telling them, your house is left unto you desolate. And he's speaking of their temple, this beautiful temple where God at one time had come down and displayed his glory and dwelt therein. That great temple that stood there at Jerusalem, that now will be left desolate. God is pulling out. And when he pulls out and leaves this place within a generation, God will send the Roman armies, and they will level that temple and level the city of Jerusalem. And that's what Matthew 24 is all about. The blood that the Jews have shed of all of God's prophets, of his teachers, of his scribes, and finally of his Son, will be brought back on them. And all of these things would come on that generation. Here's another passage in Matthew 27, when Jesus stood before Pilate. The Bible says in verse 24, Matthew 27, when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but rather that a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, his blood be on us and on our children. Friends, these Jews there on that occasion didn't realize what they'd just said. They said, we will accept responsibility for this man's death. His blood be on us and on our children. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Because 40 years later, God allowed the Roman armies to come into Jerusalem. And there they besieged that city. They broke down the walls. They destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple that was there. And historians say when the Romans got through with Jerusalem, it looked like a plowed field. It didn't even look like a city had existed there. They leveled it to the ground, just as Jesus said they would. That's what we're about to study here in Matthew 24. Now, let's look at verse 1 in the text here of Matthew 24. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. So the Lord has been at the temple teaching, and now he's departed. And now the disciples want to show him the beauty of this place, and it was a magnificent place. And incidentally, I want you to understand that this discourse we're studying in Matthew 24 is not just found in Matthew 24. In fact, let me lay another page up here, and then we'll come back to what I just read in just a moment. And I realize this text here is going to be difficult for you to see. But the destruction of Jerusalem here, this discourse in Matthew 24, is given again by Mark in Mark chapter 13, and it's given again by Luke in Luke chapter 21. In other words, we have three records of this discourse, one by Matthew, one by Mark, one by Luke. John doesn't give one in his record of the gospel, but these other three writers do. And I want to read these right quickly with you, just Matthew 24:1, Mark 13:1, and Luke 21:5. And notice the different record that they give. In Matthew's record, as that we just read, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Mark says in 13:1, and as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. In Luke's record, Luke 21:5, the same discourse, Luke says, and as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said. So you see, when you study, and we've talked about this several times in our studies with you, when you're studying the Bible and there are multiple records of something, whether it be a parable that's told in Matthew and then maybe in Mark and Luke, read all three of the records, read all three accounts, and pull the details out of each one and blend them all together, and then you get a full picture. That's really how we need to study Matthew 24. If I were studying this and we had really the time to do it, I would read all three accounts with you of each particular verse, and we would go through these one by one. But if you're studying Matthew 24 on your own, get out Mark 13 and Luke 21, and when you read a verse in Matthew, read the corresponding verse in Mark and in Luke, and get the full picture of the discourse. We're going to do this some at different intervals here in our study of Matthew 24. I'll take you, for example, to Luke's record on one occasion here tonight, and we'll compare it with Matthew's, because Luke sheds some light in different places that Matthew doesn't, and so does Mark. But basically, we'll stay with the text of Matthew. I wanted you to see these three records here. I have in the past taken all three and put them in columns. So I just made me up a little study chart and put the scripture in each section of it. Here's verse 2 across here that is covered by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Verse 3, I have them all paralleled here in these columns that you see. Here's a longer one down here, verses 9 to 14 in Matthew, 9 to 13 in Mark, and 12 to 19 in Luke. And so I'm showing you this to show you that when you study Matthew 24, get out the text of Mark 13 and Luke 21 as well and blend them all together. Now back to the text here in Matthew. Let's read it one more time and then we'll get started. I just wanted you to have that information. Matthew says in verse 1, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Now this temple at Jerusalem, historians tell us, was quite magnificent. Historians say that it rivaled many of the ancient wonders of the world in beauty. It is said that this temple, of course, faced the east. It's said that when the sun came up over the Mount of Olives and struck that temple and it just glistened, that it was a marvel to see. It was so beautiful. Now, this was actually the third temple that was at Jerusalem. Solomon built the first temple about 1,000 years before Jesus. And that temple that Solomon built was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587, 586 BC. The second temple was built under the leadership of Zerubbabel after they came back out of Babylonian captivity. And this temple that Zerubbabel built was desecrated by a man named Antiochus Epiphanes from about 167 to 164 BC. That temple lay desolate during those 3 years. There were no sacrifices offered because Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the ruler of Syria at that time, came in and took control of Jerusalem and of the temple. And he desecrated that temple. He cut off the daily sacrifice on Christmas Day, December 25th, 167 BC. He stopped all sacrifice. And that sacrificial system by the Jews was not started again until Christmas Day 3 years later in 164 BC. During that time, that temple lay desolate. He had desecrated it. Actually, Antiochus had killed a pig, and he had splattered that temple with pig broth, with pig blood, all over it and polluted it because he knew this was repulsive to the Jews. And this was an abomination of desolation there, actually, that had been predicted by Daniel. The first one, actually, there are a couple of them, and we'll see one of them tonight in chapter 24 of Matthew. Nonetheless, Solomon built the first temple, destroyed by Babylon, 587, 586. The second temple, built by Zerubbabel, was desecrated from 167 to 164. We could actually say 169 to 164 because Antiochus controlled Jerusalem during those 5 or 6 years. And then this present temple that the disciples are now bragging about and showing Jesus the beauty of. This temple was built by Herod, and he began construction on this temple about 19 BC. At one point, it is said that Herod kept 10,000 men working for 8 successive years. Lots of work. Some of the stones in this building were huge, some of them as much as 60 feet long, if you can imagine, and some of them were above 67 feet in length. Some were approximately 7.5 feet high, these stones were. They were 9 feet wide. Magnificent structure. 9 of the temple gates were overlaid with either gold or silver, and one of the gates on the temple was made of solid Corinthian brass. And so this was a magnificent structure, and it was a source of great pride to the Jews. And now the Lord's disciples come and they want to show him the buildings of this temple. Verse 2, Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now let's notice what they're talking about. They've shown him this beautiful temple there. And Jesus said, all right, you see these things? There won't be one stone here left upon another that will not be thrown down. Now that must have shocked the disciples to hear that statement. But this is exactly what the Romans did, as I mentioned. They destroyed the temple and the city in 70 AD. They left only a part of the western wall, and they left 3 towers that the Romans had built. And beyond that, they completely destroyed it and made it look like a plowed field when they got through. Now, Christ had already predicted this kind of destruction where one stone wouldn't be left upon another. Luke, in Luke 19, verse 41 to 44, mentions this. Luke says of Christ, And when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. So the Lord plainly tells them, your enemies are going to come, they're going to compass you round about, they're going to surround this city, they're going to lay it even with the ground, they're going to destroy this temple and lay it even to the ground. And you're going to be inside, and your children are going to be with you, and you're going to all suffer this. This is exactly what happened in 70 AD. The Romans came and destroyed it and didn't leave one stone upon another that was not thrown down. Verse 3. Matthew says, And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives. Now the Mount of Olives was east of the city of Jerusalem, just right outside the city walls, not very far. And upon those slopes of the Mount of Olives, you had a view down on the city and how beautiful it was, and a view right at the temple. So as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, pardon me, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Now these things, when shall these things be? Refers to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's what he's just told them about. That one stone would not be left here upon another that would not be thrown down. That their enemies would come and compass them round about and keep them in on every side and just lay that temple and that city even with the ground and wouldn't leave one stone upon another. And so they want to know, when shall these things be? If you look at the multiple records that I mentioned earlier, Jesus said unto them, this is Matthew's record, verse 3, As he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Mark says, in verse 3 and 4, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when shall these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? In Luke's record, Luke 21:7, they ask him, saying, Master, when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Friends, they're asking about the destruction of Jerusalem. When shall these things be? And these things refer to that destruction that Jesus just talked about. They want to know what is the sign of his coming. And the coming here is not the second coming of Jesus. It's the coming of Christ in judgment upon this Jewish nation and upon the city of Jerusalem. When will you be coming? What's the sign of your coming? Because obviously this kind of overthrow would be a coming, a judgment from God. It's not to be understood as the second or final coming of Christ, but a coming of Christ in judgment upon the Jews using the Roman armies. God is often said in the Old Testament especially to come in judgment, to come on his enemies, even to come on his people using a foreign army. And that's what he's talking about here. What shall be the sign of thy coming? And then he said of the end of the world. And in the phrase, the end of the word world here is not from the Greek word cosmos. There is a word in the Greek, cosmos, that refers to the physical earth and its inhabitants. That's not what the word here is. When they said, what is the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? The word here is not cosmos, like the physical earth and inhabitants. The Greek word here is aeon, and it means age. They're asking, what shall be thy sign of thy coming and of the end of the age? And that's what the word aeon means. Look it up and do a word study on it sometime. Aeon, I believe if I remember correctly from my studies, it's Strong's word number 165. And so if you want to look up 165 everywhere it's used, you'll find multiple ways it's translated. Here it means age. And in this context, it refers to the end of the Jewish age. What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age, of the Jewish age? Not the end of time. That's not under consideration. This same word, aeon, translated worlds, used in Hebrews 9:26 to refer to Jesus' first coming. Watch this. The writer says of Christ, for then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world, that's that word aeon, age. Once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So when Jesus came the first time to put away sin by his sacrifice at the cross, it says that he came once at the end of the world. Now, obviously, he didn't come at the end of time, did he? It's been 2,000 years since he came. But he came at the end of the world. That is, he came at the end of the age, the aeon, the end of the world, the end of the Jewish age. Right as the Jewish age was about to end, and it would end in about 40 years after the Lord came, before Jerusalem would be destroyed, and that would ultimately end that age. Jesus came at the end of the age, or end of the world, to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. That's the same word world there in Matthew 24. What shall be the sign of thy coming? That is, your coming in judgment, and of the end of the age, the end of the age. Premillennials misunderstand this word world. They think that when the disciples ask, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world, that's the second coming, and it's talking about the end of time. It's not. Because all of this would be fulfilled within that generation. That's what I'll show you during the course of this study, if you'll stay with me and keep an open mind. Premillennialism just fails to understand this word and what's being discussed here. This is not dealing with the end of time and the end of the world. It's the end of the Jewish age. And the sign of his coming are the signs leading up to his coming in judgment on Jerusalem, so that these stones wouldn't be left upon another. That's what he's been discussing. Verse 4, now they've asked for the signs leading up to these things. They want to know the signs when all of this destruction will take place. So In verses 4 and 5 now, Jesus begins to give them signs. These are not signs about the end of time. That's what premillennials do with these signs. They're signs leading up, remember, to the destruction of Jerusalem. I'm going to keep repeating that because you need to understand this fact in order to understand this chapter. So in verse 4, Jesus starts the signs. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, there are reports of men claiming to be the Messiah. On one occasion, there was a Samaritan named Dositheus who claimed to be the Messiah predicted by Moses. And then in Acts 5, verse 36-37, Gamaliel, who was a rabbi, a doctor of the law that Paul studied under, mentioned a fellow named Theudas and another man named Judas. Let's read the text of Matthew 5, 36-37. Gamaliel says, For before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 4,000, joined themselves, who was slain, and all as many as obeyed him were scattered and brought to naught. After this, a man rose up, Judas of Galilee, in the days of the taxing, and drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all as many as obeyed him were dispersed. Regarding this Theudas, Josephus says that he told men to follow him out to the Jordan River and that he would part the waters of the Jordan and prove that he was the Christ. And the Romans sent out soldiers after Theudas and cut his head off and dispersed his followers. In Acts 21:38, a man named Lysias there, when Paul was speaking before the Jews there in Caesarea, Lysias made reference to a radical-minded Egyptian. Actually, this was in Jerusalem, I should say, instead of Caesarea. Lysias made reference to a radical-minded Egyptian when he asked Paul, Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? Josephus, and I'm going to mention Josephus some during the course of this study. Josephus was a Jewish army general, soldier, who was captured, and he was there present as a prisoner of the Romans and witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem. He wrote a history about it. And so we have an eyewitness record from someone that was there and actually saw all the events. But Josephus wrote a history of the Jews, and you can find books called the Complete Works of Josephus and read a lot of these things for yourself. Josephus said regarding this Egyptian that Felix sent out troops against him to halt his efforts. It's said that during the reign of Nero, and friends, Nero ruled from 54 to 68 AD, that during the reign of Nero, there were so many false prophets that they were killed almost daily. And while sometimes today we will hear of somebody claiming to be the Messiah, maybe a David Koresh or some such person as this, they're very rare, but they're not the ones under consideration in this chapter, because these deceivers appeared before the destruction of Jerusalem. They've asked Christ for signs when these things would be, that is, when this destruction would take place. One of the signs was, he said, there would be false Christ, that people would come and try to deceive folks. Then he gives other signs as we continue in Matthew 24. Now verse 6. Jesus said, Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. One of the arguments that's made by premillennials today is that we have today wars and rumors of wars, and therefore the end of the world's near. But you see, Jesus said just the opposite. He said, Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled. All these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. You see, they're telling us these are signs that the end's near. Jesus said, no, it isn't. The end is not yet. And the wars that Christ referred to here are wars that were in Palestine that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Before Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, there were wars that broke out all over Judea. Josephus tells us that Palestine was full of wars in that age. In 40 AD, 50,000 Jews were killed. In 49 AD, 10 to 20,000 were killed at Jerusalem. Also in 49, 20,000 Jews were killed at Caesarea. On another occasion, about 20,000 were destroyed by the Samaritans. Other accounts tell us that 13,000 Jews were killed at Scythopolis, another 50,000 at Alexandria, 10,000 were killed at Damascus. And when Christ spoke of wars and rumors of wars, he had reference there to first century events. Remember, he's giving the signs leading up to when these things shall be. That is, this destruction of Jerusalem, when one stone would not be left upon another. These are signs of his coming in judgment upon Jerusalem through Rome and of the end of the age. He's not talking about things in this day and time. We've got to understand that, or we won't understand this chapter. And then he gives further signs in verse 7 and 8. Jesus said, "For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." Almost every time when we hear of a famine or a pestilence, and especially an earthquake, we're warned by premillennials that the end of the world's near. But first of all, Jesus said these are the beginning of sorrows, not the end. These are the beginning. But today, when you preach about famines and pestilences, and especially earthquakes, why, people really get excited by that. Now, this tickles the ear, and yet it proves nothing about the second coming of Christ and the destruction of the physical earth, because the things here in Matthew 24 are first century events. They're leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. They are signs that preceded all this destruction. Now, Jesus mentioned famines and pestilences and earthquakes. There were famines recorded during this time in history before Jerusalem's destruction. The scriptures record one such famine in Acts 11, verse 27 and 28. This takes place about 50 AD, about 20 years before Jerusalem fell. But the Bible says that in those days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, who signified by the Spirit that there should be great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Claudius, incidentally, was the one who ruled before Nero. If I remember correctly, Claudius reigned from 41 to 54 AD, right in this time frame. And this came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, because this happened about 50 AD or so, and he reigned till around 54 before Nero took over. Then pestilences. Jesus said there would be signs of pestilences. And there were pestilences at Babylon in 40 AD and in Rome at 60 AD. There were many deaths because of these events. And then Christ said there would be earthquakes in divers places. Before 70 AD, earthquakes occurred in the following places. Listen: Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Asmos, Rome, Apamea, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Campania, and Judea. All these places recorded earthquakes, just exactly what Jesus said would happen. These are signs that are leading up to that destruction. Then, as he continues with his signs, he tells the disciples things that will happen to them. Now, I want you to remember, friends, he's talking to the 12 here. He's talking to the apostles. And then look what he tells them in verses 9 to 14 as we continue. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted and shall kill you. Now, he's talking to the 12. Remember that. And ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended and shall betray one another and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. And when he says the end, he's talking about the end of Jerusalem. So he's told the disciples all of these things. He said they're going to deliver you up to be afflicted. They're going to kill you. You're going to be hated of all nations. How many modern day Christians are afflicted and killed? Now, I'm sure there's some around the world, but the apostles and the early Christians were killed. The slaughter of Christians during the reign of Nero, we're told from historians, was massive. It was terrible. Nero burned the city of Rome and then blamed it on Christians. And a man named Suetonius wrote a book called The 12 Caesars. That's quite a good little read if you'd like to read that book sometime and study the Caesars just briefly. Suetonius says that Nero had many Christians crucified on crosses there on the streets of Rome. He had oil poured upon their bodies. He set their bodies on fire. And the burning bodies of Christians were used as street lights for chariot races at night in the days of Nero. If the traditional story of Paul's death is accurate, Paul was beheaded by Nero in 68 AD, and that's the year Nero died. But Paul died evidently that same year, if that tradition's correct. Nero beheaded him. And so the Lord's told these apostles here, they're going to deliver you up to be afflicted. They're going to kill you. You're going to be hated of all nations. Do you know of any preachers today that are hated of all nations? Well, friends, the apostles were. Early Christians were. They were hated everywhere they went. Everywhere. These disciples here, Jesus said, he that will endure unto the end. This is those who remain faithful to Christ through all these afflictions and hatred and deceivers and betrayal and death. And then Christ said that this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all men, and then shall the end come. So the gospel was to be preached in all the world before the end came. And we hear preachers today on the radio and on television, I've heard them many times, say to their audience, you need to send money into this ministry. Send all that you can right now. Give generously, because we need to take the gospel to all the world so that Jesus can come. They think this passage here in Matthew, verse 14, 24:14, is talking about the gospel being taken to the whole world so that the end of time will occur. And that's not what Jesus is talking about at all. He says this gospel of the kingdom would be preached in all the world for a witness unto all men, all nations, and then the end would come. But he's talking about the end of Jerusalem. Did you know that the gospel in the first century was preached in all nations for a witness unto all men? Did you know that every person heard the gospel in the first century? Did you know the Bible teaches that? Notice with me in Colossians chapter 1, in fulfillment of what Jesus said, Paul said in Colossians 1 verse 23, he told the church at Colossae, if you continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you have heard and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Do you see that, friends? Paul said the gospel was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. And Paul wrote this Colossian letter somewhere around 61 to 64 AD, likely 63 to 64 AD. He wrote it while he was a prisoner in Rome to the church at Colossae. And he told the Colossians the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. That's what Jesus said would happen. That this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all men, and then shall the end come. Now, before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Paul wrote Colossians around 63, 64, 6 or 7 years before Jerusalem was destroyed. Paul said the gospel had already been preached in all the world, that every creature had heard it. Isn't that interesting? That's one of the signs leading up to the destruction of when these things would be and what would be the sign of Christ coming at the end of the age. See? Then the Lord continues with other signs. Verse 15 through 22. Jesus said, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened." Verse 15, Jesus said, "When you therefore shall see," remember, he's giving them signs. "When you see the abomination of desolation, stand in the holy place," spoken of by Daniel. Friends, what is the abomination of desolation? Do you know what Hal Lindsey says it is? He says it's when Antichrist sets up a statue of himself in the temple at Jerusalem and demands worship. Now, you couldn't get that out of this passage with a crowbar. And Hal Lindsey never got that out of this passage. This is part of his imagination. You see, Lindsey, like a lot of premillennials, brings his premillennial theory to the Bible. Rather than go to the Bible to see what it teaches, he brings his teaching, his ideas to the Bible and tries to make the Bible fit them. Jesus is not talking about an Antichrist here when he talks about the abomination of desolation. The Bible tells us exactly what this abomination of desolation is, and it does it especially in Luke's account of this discourse. Now let me find here they are, my multiple copies. I had these laid up here. I want to read the passage, the scripture we just read with you from Matthew. Then I want you to look at Mark's record of it. Then I want you to look at Luke's. Remember, I told you all three writers give an account of this discourse. So I lifted out these verses 15 through 22. In Mark 13, they're verses 14 through 20. And in Luke 21, they're verses 20 through 24. And let me read these three accounts, and then we will see what the abomination of desolation is. It is not Antichrist. I showed you in the study of the beast, remember, a two-part study. There is no future Antichrist spoken of in Revelation or in the Bible here in these discourses. He's mentioned the word Antichrist, I think, appears maybe 5 times, but it's in 1 John. It's in the Gospel of John, the small books of John. The word Antichrist is not found in Revelation anywhere. It's not found in Matthew 24 anywhere. Hal Lindsey brings it into Matthew 24, but it's not in the text. What is the abomination of desolation? Well, let's read the three records here. First, again, Matthew 24, 15 to 22. Now remember, he's speaking to the disciples. He's speaking about the Jews. "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." Now I'm just going to stop there because I'll cover these other verses in a minute. He said, when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke about, stand in the holy place, then those in Judea need to flee into the mountains. Mark 13, let's read here now, verse 14. "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains." Luke's record, Luke 21, verse 20. "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains." Do you see what the abomination of desolation is, friends? Luke tells us here it's Jerusalem compassed with armies. That's the abomination of desolation. It's not talking about an Antichrist setting up his statue in the temple. And incidentally, that's something I haven't shared with you, but premillennials believe that that a temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem and the Jews will start animal sacrifices again. They believe that. And they believe that's got to happen before the Great Tribulation because Antichrist, they tell us, will set up a statue of himself in that restored temple at Jerusalem where animals are sacrificed again. Now that's taught nowhere in the Bible, but it's taught in their theory. They actually believe this, that the temple will be rebuilt and animal sacrifices resumed, and that Antichrist, when he comes, will find that rebuilt temple and he'll set his own statue up in that and desecrate it. And so that's the abomination of desolation, they say. And that's nonsense. Luke says, when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh at hand. Now, this is the true abomination of desolation. The heathen armies of Rome were an abomination to the Jews. And these abominable heathen armies were about to bring desolation or destruction upon Jerusalem. Hence, the abomination of desolation is, as Jesus said, Jerusalem compassed by armies, the Roman armies. That's this destruction we're talking about. Jerusalem compassed by armies, the Roman armies. This chapter is dealing with Jerusalem's destruction. It's not dealing with a supposed Antichrist. And if Mr. Lindsay and others wouldn't bring their theories into the Bible, if they would come to the chapter itself and read these parallel records like we've done, the Bible will tell them and tell all of us what the abomination of desolation is. But you see, they want to bring their theory. They've got a 7-year tribulation, and I showed you last week they don't have 7 years left in Daniel 9 for a tribulation. That prophecy in Daniel 9's already been fulfilled. Jesus died in the last year, the last 7 years, I should say, of that prophecy, right in the middle of it. It's already happened. But they bring their theories to the book, and you can't do that and ever come out with the truth. You've got to come to the Bible, friends, with an open mind and let God teach you, because that's why He's given His Word, so we can know what His will is. And His will is certainly not Antichrist setting up statues and rebuilt temples. No, the abomination of desolation is Jerusalem compassed by the Roman armies. As I said, the Roman armies were an abomination, and they laid desolate Jerusalem. And that's what the abomination of desolation is. Furthermore, you'll notice in verse 16 that we read over here in Matthew, those in Judea were to flee to the mountains. Now, here in recent years, we've seen people go out to the Rocky Mountains, trying to flee what they thought was destruction that was coming, and they misunderstood Matthew 24. I've known people that actually moved, uprooted, leaving homes and businesses and everything else, leaving places in Texas or Arkansas, Oklahoma, other places, moving out to Colorado, fleeing to the mountains. But it's talking about those that were in Judea, not those in the United States, not those in England, not those that are in Australia, not those that are anywhere in Europe. But he said those in Judea were to flee into the mountains. This applied to those in Judea when they saw the Roman armies approaching or surrounding Jerusalem. Again in verse 17, Jesus said, those on the housetop were not to try to come down to take anything out of their houses. Now, how many of you spend a lot of time up on your housetop? Do you just go up there a lot and sit around? Do you spend a lot of time on the housetop? Well, of course, the Jews did, because they had flat-topped houses. That was really their patios. That's where they lounged a lot. And they usually had an outside stair leading up to the roof, and the roof being flat, they went up on the housetop. And you remember in Acts 10 and 9, when we studied the conversion of Cornelius, the first Gentile ever converted, Peter was in Joppa. And remember, he went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, about noon, and became hungry. That's in Acts 10 and 9. It was common for people to spend time on the housetop. We don't dwell on the housetops today. Our housetops are not flat for the most part. Then Christ speaks of those who were in the field, verse 18. Tells them not to come back and get their clothes. And I'm sure you'd agree that very few people work in the fields today, but in Bible times, this was a very common practice. He speaks of those that are with child, those nursing and giving suck in those days in verse 19, because it would be more difficult. Woe unto them that are with child, he said, and to them that give suck in those days, because it's difficult to flee. And they weren't fleeing in Chevrolets and Fords and Dodges. They didn't have automobiles. They were having to flee by foot. And of course, it's hard to travel with little ones and when you're nursing babies. Then he said, pray that your flight be not in the winter, verse 20, because in the winter, of course, travel's a whole lot more difficult. Neither on the Sabbath day, he said, because the gates of the city would be closed on the Sabbath. It would be difficult to get out of there. And then he said in verse 21, he warns the disciples, then there shall be great tribulation. And this is not a future 7-year tribulation. It's the tribulation associated with the destruction of Jerusalem. And finally, he says in verse 22 that the length of this tribulation for the elect's sake, those days would be shortened. This tribulation would be shortened for the elect. That's exactly what happened. Let me give you some history. Jerusalem was first attacked by the Roman general Cestius Gallus in the middle of October 66 AD. 66 AD, October. Josephus says that after a week of fighting, the Roman army had nearly taken the city. But for some unknown reason, General Gallus withdrew his forces and ceased the fighting. And when he did that, every Christian still remaining in Jerusalem fled across the Jordan River over on the east side to the city of Pella. Not one Christian of whom we have any record died at Jerusalem in the siege in 70 AD. In 66 AD, they saw the signs and they fled and went over to Pella. And after Vespasian became emperor in 69, he sent his son Titus again to besiege Jerusalem. That was on April 14th, 70 AD. By the end of the war there in 70 AD, listen, Josephus said that 1,100,000 Jews were killed in Jerusalem. Now that's this destruction Jesus is talking about. 1,100,000 Jews were slaughtered right there in the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Josephus said 97,000 of them were captured and sold as slaves down in Egypt. And actually, they ran out of buyers down there. They flooded the market so much in Egypt with Jewish slaves they couldn't even sell them after a while, because 97,000 Jews were taken down to Egypt and sold into slavery if they could find a buyer. Josephus said the total number of Jews killed all around Palestine, all around Judea, at this time was 1,357,000. The food supply in Jerusalem during that time, you see, Rome had the city surrounded. No food could get in. They didn't have food. There's all of these inhabitants, well over 1 million there in that city. And they've run out of food. There is no food supply. And they became so hungry, the Jews did during this siege, that they actually roasted their own children and ate them. Now, I know that sounds awful, and it is. But this was predicted by Moses over 1,500 years before it happened. I want to read you Moses' prediction about how even the Jews during this time would become hungry enough to eat their own children. Moses warned them in Deuteronomy 28, and let's read verse 49 to 68. And notice this warning Moses gave. He's warning them about departing from God, about forsaking God's law, about disobeying him, about going into idolatry and such things, and about the judgments that they could expect if they weren't faithful to God as a nation. He said in verse 49, Moses did, Deuteronomy 28, The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, oil, or the increase of thy kine, or flocks, or thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, listen, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee in the siege and in the strait, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. So that the man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children, which he shall leave, so that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left him in the siege, and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear, for she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates. If thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance, and sore sicknesses, and of long continuance. Moreover, he will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. And ye shall be left few in number, whereas you were stars, as the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou wouldest not obey the voice of the Lord thy God. And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good, to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you, and to bring you to naught. And ye shall be plucked from off the land, whither thou goest to possess it. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations thou shalt find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But the Lord shall give thee a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were evening. And at even thou shalt say, Would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt, again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Just exactly what I mentioned to you a while ago, when 97,000 of them were taken captive and taken to Egypt and sold as slaves, and they couldn't even find a buyer. Ultimately, they ran out of buyers. That's exactly what Moses said. No one will buy you. I mean, because absolutely they flooded the market with slaves, Jewish slaves. This is the destruction that Jesus is trying to warn them about that came on Jerusalem in 70 AD. Friends, the signs that we're reading were signs leading up to that destruction and that end. This is the coming of Christ through Rome on the Jewish people who had killed his prophets and ultimately killed God's Son. And Jesus had told them, your house is left unto you desolate. And 40 years later, after he gave this discourse, the Romans came and leveled that city, killing 1,100,000 Jews just right there at Jerusalem, and capturing 97,000 more and selling them as slaves. This was a horrible time, so bad that, as we've read here, they ate their own children trying to stay alive. It was a horrible time in Jewish history. Now, I would love to continue. We have a whole lot more to get to, and I'd really like to get to this next section. But I'm going to quit off here tonight, and we'll take this up next Wednesday, Lord willing. We'll start in at verse 23, and I'll give you a little recap of what we've covered tonight, and then we'll move on and cover the rest of the chapter. We have a whole lot to cover in our study. As I said, we'll deal with at least the first 34 verses. Let me say before we close, I know probably some of you have questions about some of the things that we've studied, and so we're thinking about just doing one Wednesday evening to where we just take written questions that you can submit in advance, and we're talking about this. We haven't decided on that completely, nor when we would do that, but probably if we do it, it'll be very soon. And you'll be able to submit some written questions. We may not get to all your questions, but we'll try to answer them. I'm thinking about when we get through with this series of giving you a summary of all the things, just taking one study and summarizing all this. And it may be that when we do that summary that we'll go ahead and take some questions as well. So we'll be getting with you in the next week or two about that regarding what we'll do when we make that decision. Tonight, I want to thank you very much for joining us in the study. And I hope this study's been understandable. I hope it's been interesting. And I would just say this to you: don't miss the next study, the second part to this. It's really a very important aspect of it. And there's some things that I think you'll learn that will be surprising to you, some things that will be of great benefit. I'll show you some of the modern day predictions that have been made. For example, how Lincoln predicted the rapture in 1981 and the second coming of Jesus in 1988. I'll show you his prediction and how he began to crawfish on that prediction when it wasn't coming true. I'll show you another man that predicted the rapture in 1988 and the second coming of Jesus in December of 1995. His name is Edgar Whisenant. I'll show you that prediction. And then there's a man by the name of Jack Van Impe. Van Impe made multiple predictions of the Lord's return, the year 2000, 2007, 2012, 2017, and 2018. Mr. Van Impe unfortunately passed away a year or so ago, and yet he made several predictions of the Lord's return before he died. We'll talk about some of those. I'll show you how premillennials base these predictions, where they get their predictions, what they're based upon, and it's really the teaching of Jesus about the fig tree in verse 32 to 34 of this chapter. So don't miss this second part. I hope you can see it, and it would just be so beneficial to you, and we'd love to have you. We're doing this for you and for your benefit, and I hope that you find all of these things profitable and useful. They'll be up on the web. They'll be there for a resource material for you to study them as often as you need to understand the things that are taught. And I hope they're a blessing to you. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Until next Wednesday night, if God permits, we bid you a very pleasant good evening. God bless you.